Hey, I'm Jesse from Bearable. Welcome to the Bearable podcast, where we talk to medical professionals about the experiences of people with hard to diagnose conditions, chronic conditions, and hidden illnesses. I hope you enjoyed this episode. All right, so welcome to the first episode of the Bearable podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. Johannes Driessen. He is, full disclosure, my brother as well, a convenient guest for the first episode. And we're going to be talking to him today about his experience with patients who self-diagnose, and also generally treating patients with hard to diagnose conditions as well. So, Johannes, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction and let our audience know how you became a doctor?
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the two most important things already, that I'm your brother and that I'm a doctor. So yeah, I've been a doctor for, I think four-ish years now. So it's something I started relatively later on in life. And for the last couple of years, I've been a GP trainee. So that's a 3 or 4 year process where we rotate through different hospital jobs and ultimately go into full-time GP training. Well, I'll be doing that in September. So yeah, it's been a slightly non-traditional version of the training program. But yeah, here I am working in South London, living the dream.
Absolutely. Do you want to touch on at all anything you were doing before you went down this career path? Because you've had some kind of I suppose relevant experiences prior to becoming a doctor as well, right? In terms of maybe the pharmaceutical work you did, or even your first master's degree.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a scattergun CV. So I did an undergraduate master's in neuroscience, which I started in 2003. And as you mentioned, I've kind of done a lot of part-time work in pharmacy. So I was a dispenser for, I think, part-time for about 15 years. So I got a lot of kind of initial patient interaction over the counter in that way. And I've done a couple of years in the defense industry in the military, which is a bit of a segue away from healthcare and the kind of physical sciences, and then headed back into medicine as my current and hopefully ongoing career.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Who knows with you? It could change at any moment, I feel like.
There is always a risk, yeah.
Absolutely. I wondered as well, just while we're talking about it, if any of those past experiences or kind of past educational or career paths have influenced or had an impact on your approach to being a doctor as well.
Yeah, it's not something I've really reflected on that much. I think working in pharmacy gave me a lot of experience of dealing with people and dealing with their kind of health anxieties, and sometimes having to kind of rationalize those anxieties a little bit, just from the perspective of someone who didn't really have any qualifications, but was giving health advice over the counter. And I think the other thing is just having worked in kind of really different sectors of work. So, working in the military, working in healthcare, and working for private companies as well. You just meet a huge range of different people and personality types, and you meet people with all kinds of different life views, world views. So I think it's been good just to kind of see a much broader cross section of the population that I now work with, because I think if you start in one field and kind of stay there, you can see the world as the bubble around you. Mm-hmm. So I guess that has been useful in just understanding human beings a little bit better.
That sounds like quite a useful skill to have if you're going to be a doctor working with human beings every day.
Absolutely. You should all have 10 different careers and join the military for a few years before you try and understand people.
Absolutely.
Good solid career advice.
I guess one of the things I'm interested in talking about first is the fact that you're obviously still training. And so I did want to ask you about like how training maybe prepares you for people with hard to diagnose conditions, chronic conditions, hidden illnesses, however you refer to them. Is that something that there is explicit training for?
I think it's something which people are starting to address in medical education. I think it's becoming something that universities are becoming more aware of. And I think the whole way that medicine is taught is trying to move away from this kind of traditional paternalistic structure and understand medicine as more of a social construct, trying to kind of adopt patient-centered care as opposed to doctor-centered care. But I think it's still in its infancy, and it's something that people are still exploring and trying to fit into the existing structures of education and practice. So I think at the university level, it's something which is just beginning to kind of happen in a real way. During my foundation training, which is the first 2 years of being a doctor, we had some really useful insights from some of the psychiatrists who help the medical and surgical doctors to find strategies for care for these people, particularly in hospital settings, and to try and give an understanding of, what some of these people and these patients with complicated medical conditions, what they're experiencing, and how we can work with them to try and help them, because quite often there isn't a concrete solution to kind of fixing these problems, which is what a lot of people are looking for and what a lot of doctors instinctively want to do. So it kind of, to some extent, it does kind of blow our minds, because we're taught about, the body as a complex machine, and when something doesn't fit that stereotype, it's not that we don't want to fix it or can't fix it, but it's just a whole different mindset. So we had some really, really insightful input from one psychiatrist in particular. But it is kind of, it's a little bit of bonus material on top of a curriculum which isn't really kind of skewed in that direction. Because I think, although it's becoming much more recognized, it is still a relative minority group of conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think it's something that that is being recognized slowly, and I think doctors are really grateful for being given those insights, but it's not something which is kind of a core part of the curriculum as I've experienced it so far.
I mean, it's reassuring in the first place that it is something that's maybe increasingly being looked at. I think as well, and we'll probably touch on this more, one of the problems is maybe that both patients and doctors are given a very short window in which to obtain a diagnosis. I think a lot of people who self-diagnose feel like they know what they have. They go to a GP's appointment. There's 10 minutes for them to try and convince a GP that they have this thing that they think they have, and it's maybe not that simple either. I suppose we'll touch on this, but I guess a natural follow-up to that is what is your real world experience with people who maybe have hard to diagnose conditions, or maybe come to you with a chronic condition? Do you have experience with patients like that?
Yeah, so we've talked in the past about how because I'm in training and because I'm moving through different specialties at the moment, it's not a type of patient that I work with regularly at the moment, but certainly in the past I've worked with patients who have one of a variety of complex medical conditions. Some people have certainly come in and told me, for example, that they have post-traumatic stress disorder when they haven't kind of been assigned that diagnosis by a medical professional, but they're kind of confident that that's the situation they're in. And similarly, when I worked as a foundation doctor elsewhere, there was a fairly substantial group of young women who had kind of chronic abdominal pain. that would come in to the surgical ward for diagnosis and management of their conditions. So it's something I have come across. I think for a lot of doctors, it's something that we kind of experience to some extent. And I think when I'm working full time as a GP, it's something that I will experience a lot more. But each of those cases is really different and unique, because, you know, everyone is different. There are similarities between the cases, and I think one of the main similarities is that quite often you get this adversarial relationship between patients and doctors, and that happens for a lot of reasons. And like you mentioned, some people will either through reading online or through forming communities with people who have similar symptoms and similar experiences, will kind of pick out a diagnosis that they feel is appropriate for them. And then going to a GP, and, you know, these days you'll quite often see a different GP every time because of the way that surgeries are set up these days. You'll kind of present your opening statement to a GP who has their own mental model of how to have a consultation with a patient, which involves kind of, you know, delving into the background and trying to understand you and build some rapport. And I think when you have the clash of the two mental models, where the patient just wants to say, I have this condition, what can you do for me? And the doctor has their own way of trying to draw out all of these clues about what's going on and what's happening. And then if you combine that with the fact that there's a huge amount of time pressure to deal with something, then quite often that is an unsatisfactory consultation. Mm-hmm. And I think the more often that happens, the more fraught both sides become, and the more that a doctor might start to see a patient or a group of patients as being frustrating because they're not playing by the doctor's rules of how to help someone. And equally, the patients kind of sat there thinking, oh, it's this person's job to help me manage my condition. And they're just kind of wasting time asking me all these irrelevant questions, either doing or not doing tests that I feel are relevant or are irrelevant, or suggesting strategies which I don't feel will help me. And again, something that we've talked about before is just how I think doctors and patients both need to have a lot more empathy and patience and open-mindedness about the fact that, you know, we're not primarily trained to work with patients who have complex or difficult to define problems, and equally patients, you know, normal people in society aren't trained to feed doctors exactly the right bits of information. And I think we both need to just be a bit more patient, a bit more understanding about the complexity of the health service in general, the limitations of the health service. And if we both believe that we're aiming for the same thing, which is to help each other to come to a kind of mutually beneficial understanding and to help the patient, I think we're much more likely to reach a satisfactory result for everyone. It's a really difficult situation, I think, for both parties. And I think the really disheartening thing is when doctors kind of see these patients. There's this kind of term, you know, a heart sink patient. When someone comes into the room, you know that their situation is complicated, their life is complicated. You're probably not going to be able to help them in the way they want. But it's really derogatory to see a patient kind of as a stressful, disappointing thing before they've even had that interaction with you. But equally, it's really frustrating as a doctor when you are trying to help someone in your own way, and they're not allowing you to do your job in the way that you know how to do it. Complicated.
Yeah, it sounds difficult. I think actually it's quite, and it's maybe the reason behind why I wanted to have this conversation, is that like my personal experience has been, I think, similar to a lot of the people that use Bearable, which is that when I was in my early 20s, I had an eating disorder. I had anorexia. I classified it that way myself. I'd self-diagnosed it as being anorexia because it ticked all of the boxes I associated with that illness. And when I went to see my GP, they essentially said to me, you don't have that, or I'm not going to treat you as though you have that. And I think I left feeling frustrated because it was something I'd lived with for over a year at that point. And yeah, my expectation was like, I know I have this, I want this person to validate this. So can you actually explain from the doctor's perspective, maybe like why something like that is harder to diagnose, or what the process might be to diagnose something that's difficult? Why can't it be done within a 10-minute slot? Why does it need to take longer?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't speak for the doctor that you had that interaction with, and I think it's really sad that you were kind of blocked so kind of abruptly in reaching a diagnosis. But yeah, it, again, like everything we're going to talk about today, it's complicated. I think to some extent, and something you've mentioned to me before, is that that part of it will be to do with stereotypes. And, you know, we as medical students are taught about the stereotyped patient that might come in with a particular problem. So when a doctor or any member of the public imagines a patient with anorexia, you're probably not typical of that patient. And certainly for a doctor who works with people with eating disorders, they're going to have a much more broad understanding of what a patient looks like who has anorexia. And the trick is that, you know, that's the tricky thing, is that that's not the person you're going to see first. You're going to see someone who is much more of a generalist, whether that's your GP or someone in A&E. And it's about working around the stereotypes that exist about all kinds of different conditions. So I think to some extent there will be a degree of, whether it's subconscious or conscious bias, there will be issues about you know, you not fitting a stereotype of what a doctor is expecting to see in a person who has a condition like that. But equally, I think one of the things that gets really tricky is the fact that all of these diagnoses in general are associated with a number of really specific criteria. So some diagnoses will be diagnoses of exclusion, where you look for, you know, 101 different things, and if you can't find any, and you're still left with this constellation of symptoms, then you might say, okay, well, we've excluded all of these other things, so it must be this diagnosis. But for the majority of conditions, and especially conditions where there is a mental health dimension to them, there will be very specific criteria that you have to meet in order to receive a specific diagnosis. And I think that's not something that is maybe very well understood by people who are experiencing these symptoms, because, you know, you can have 99.9% of the experiences in common with someone who has a diagnosis of anorexia, for example. But if you don't meet the specific criteria, that might just not be the name that we give it. There might be a subtly different name which you're not familiar with, or which doesn't feel right to you. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're being dismissed or that we're not taking the condition seriously. I mean, obviously there will be some cases where a doctor just thinks that maybe you don't have the thing you think you have, and that does happen sometimes, that people do get caught up on a diagnosis that maybe does explain or would explain some of their symptoms, but maybe you're kind of looking in the wrong direction for the answers. And I think as human beings, we look for patterns. We want answers to things. We see kind of constellations of symptoms, and we try and put them together and find a solution. And sometimes, you know, sometimes you will be barking up the wrong tree. Mm-hmm. But I think, again, it comes back to listening to that patient's perspective, trying to understand why they feel that diagnosis is appropriate to them, and then seeing if they meet criteria to meet that diagnosis, or if maybe there's something else going on that needs to be explored. And it comes back to that thing of understanding each other's processes, each other's priorities, and just being open-minded to the fact that you both do want to help in general. I mean, it sounds like your experience wasn't particularly fruitful, but in general, if you both bear with each other and try to understand each other's motivations, then you will reach a conclusion, and it may not be where either of you thought you'd end up, but it may be the right place when you get there eventually.
I suppose that's one of the like tricky parts, is that I think there is still this situation in society where like doctors are revered, and you kind of assume that they can like give you an answer within a single meeting. Like, it's important to remember, I suppose, that like doctors are human beings, and you know, they're prone to getting things wrong or needing time to figure things out, especially if they are harder to diagnose. I think it was certainly part of my experience too, is that I had this expectation that I would just be given a diagnosis, and maybe that didn't help with that process either, where I was like adamant that that's what was going to happen. And so my reaction when that didn't happen was to be maybe very dismissive. So I guess the like natural follow-up to that is that like being aware that, you know, a diagnosis can take time, that you need to be patient, that you maybe need to like present your case over a period of time. Is there like, what are the steps that a person who is seeking diagnosis should take? Like, should they be trying to figure out if their doctor, their current GP, is the right doctor for them to be talking to? Should they switch doctors? Can they present like health journaling or health tracking or some sort of data to show, maybe in my example, like dramatic weight loss, or like a food diary that shows that, you know, I haven't necessarily been eating everything I should be over a long period of time? Like, what are the steps you'd recommend for somebody who's doing that for the first time?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I don't think anyone who feels that they have an eating disorder should try and demonstrate dramatic weight loss. I don't want to kind of incentivize anyone to to lose more weight to try and hit a diagnostic criterion. That's absolutely not where we want to go.
No, just to clarify, I mean more like, if I had been journaling my existing weight loss, would that information have been helpful?
Yeah, and I think again, it really depends on the doctor you're talking to, and it depends on the patient as well. If it's something that you find really helpful, I think regardless of what your doctor thinks, I think it's worth doing, because I think if it gives you an understanding of, you know, what constitutes a good day or a bad day and what other things are associated with that, I think that can be a really therapeutic tool to help you manage the day-to-day. May not be something that's going to, you know, solve the problem or, you know, give you a cure, but I think it can be therapeutic in helping you to understand the symptoms you're experiencing and how you're feeling day to day. I think for some doctors, they would love it, and for some doctors, it will just eat more into that kind of precious 10 minutes that you have to try and fix everything in the universe, which is always difficult. In terms of changing your GP, again, it's a really, I know I'm saying tricky a lot. It's really tricky because I think if you move a lot and your medical record shows that you've kind of gotten through 6 or 7 GPs in a year, that's immediately going to kind of create this impression before someone meets you. And no matter how open-minded someone is, if someone sees that a patient has moved 6 or 7 times in a year, you're subconsciously going to be wondering, like, what's going on? Like, 100 things will go through your mind, but it will just, I think in most GPs, it would make you a little bit wary of what's going to happen. And at the same time, I think absolutely, if you meet with a GP for the first time and they're dismissive of you and they don't listen to you and they try and pigeonhole you in a certain way, and you just feel that relationship is never going to go anywhere, then absolutely the right thing to do is to try someone else. You could just ask to see someone else from the same practice if you're at a practice with more than one GP, which is most of them these days. But I think, again, it's about taking time, having realistic expectations about what can be achieved. You know, everyone has bad days. GPs have plenty of bad days. So it might be that you just caught someone on the wrong day and they rushed off their feet. It's late in the day, stressed, whatever else. And I wouldn't dismiss an interaction on the first go. And I know that's really difficult because a lot of the time you'll wait weeks and weeks and weeks for an appointment. And then if you have an unsatisfying interaction with someone, you feel like, that's a month that's gone down the drain because that was your one opportunity to kind of advocate for yourself and seek help. And sometimes it isn't fruitful. And that's much more frustrating for the patient, but it's frustrating for the doctor as well, because as I keep saying, in general, we want to help, and it's really frustrating when we have an unsatisfactory interaction with someone. So I think, if it's absolute barn door, this person is never going to understand me, then maybe speak to someone else in the practice. Maybe speaking to someone other than a doctor in the first instance would be useful. So I don't know if you know about social prescribers, but sometimes they're a really good point of contact in a practice. So not everywhere has a social prescriber in-house, but they're just incredible people who can fix things in your life which doctors don't know about, but have traditionally sometimes ended up doing. So anything to do with kind of housing or just lifestyle issues, finances, all of those kind of complicated life skills that you're just expected to have as an adult, social prescribers can often help with. So sometimes as a kind of interim measure or as something that runs in parallel, they can be really good people just to help you get other parts of life under control. And quite often they'll have access to some of the services that a doctor could refer to as well. So I think, look at other GPs in the practice if you're struggling. Look at other people in the practice in general who might be able to give you some initial support. And it's a two-way relationship where you both have to build trust with each other. You have to understand each other's pressures and points of view. And I think if you can see that a GP or another doctor is someone that you could potentially build a kind of understanding with, then just be prepared for that to take a little bit of time. And it will get there. And there will be frustrating times, but that's just part of the human experience.
I suppose if you have a hard to diagnose condition, it's going to be hard to diagnose for any GP, right? So I think it's maybe accepting that it could take a bit of time before that happens, and finding a person that you feel will hear you and will work with you in a way that you feel comfortable with. And maybe like treating it more as a typical human interaction rather than having set expectations about what a doctor should be doing, but actually talking to them and saying, what do you need from me? And how can I help you to understand what I'm living with? Kind of along those lines as well. I suppose often it is, or it can be difficult to explain your symptoms to a doctor, especially when there's a small window of time that you have to do that. I know that as a person with depression and anxiety, brain fog and memory loss and having quite a wide array of symptoms can make it hard to explain exactly what's happened in the last few months of my life that have made me feel like I want a specific diagnosis or there's a specific issue. I think in the past you've mentioned taking somebody with you to advocate for you as well. Is that something you want to talk about a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think it's a good insurance policy, because if you have been waiting a month to get an appointment and you've got 10 minutes to make your case, that's a really high stakes situation to be in, and that extra stress can make you even more struggle even more to fully make use of that time efficiently. So I've had a lot of patients come in before where they've just written everything out that they're experiencing. And although that can sometimes be overwhelming because it might be a problem list of 10 different things and you have to pick one or two of them, that can be one way just to remind yourself. And as you said, I think if you talk through a situation with a friend before you go to the GP, that can be really helpful for a number of reasons. First of all, I think to have another person's perspective and someone that you already trust to give you their perspective and to help you just organize those thoughts and pick out what's really important. and then to be with you, to just give you a bit of confidence, to maybe steer you in the right direction if you do go off track, and to make sure you get those key points across. I think that can be really helpful. Obviously, in the time of pandemics and all kinds of other chaos, it may not be feasible. But even if it's a telephone conversation, having someone around is a good idea. And I think in general, most GPs would be on board with that. I think also if someone comes in with a kind of an advocate or a friend, as long as they're happy with confidentiality and with having information shared with them, I think that can be quite reassuring for the doctor as well, because as I said, I think we want that interaction to be efficient and smooth, and we want it to be high yield as well. So we want to be able to get as much done as possible in that brief interaction. So there's someone there who's helping to kind of steer us back onto the right track, and maybe to just almost kind of mitigate some of the possible tensions, because they, being removed from the situation to some extent, they may be better placed to kind of understand both the doctor's stress and the patient's situation as well. I think it's pretty much a win-win. And at the moment, that might need to be a friend on speakerphone while you're having a consultation with a GP. But I think it's just a good idea. The other thing you've mentioned to me before is kind of having a record of your symptoms, or looking at kind of correlations between things. And again, I think for some GPs that will work really well. I think the problem we sometimes have is that we have kind of very specific ways of giving someone a diagnosis, or looking at the severity of depression or anxiety or something. So we have our own tools. And they are quite intuitive. They're not difficult to apply. But I think they're kind of less useful for someone with those symptoms to use in their own time. I think apps like Bearable can be really good for people to kind of get a better understanding of what's going on in their life, what triggers symptoms, what will lead to a better day rather than a worse day. And I think offering those to your GP, it's worth a go. And it'll either work or it won't work. But I think it goes back to kind of being open-minded, giving everything a shot, accepting that some things won't work, accepting that everything's personal, everyone has their own preferences. But
I guess it comes back to kind of like treating your doctor again a bit more like a human being, and saying, is this something that you would find useful, and offering it as an option, rather than assuming that having potentially an overwhelming amount of data could be only a positive thing. It could be something that actually hinders the process too.
And I don't want people to feel like I'm just saying that you need to treat your doctors better, and I'm just saying that everyone just needs to appreciate that this is complicated stuff and it will take time, and doctors need to be a lot more empathetic towards patients as well. It's a two-way street.
For sure. I think that's a really positive thing to hear, because I think often, for people with chronic illnesses or hard to diagnose illnesses, there are a lot of negative experiences with doctors, but I think it's right to want to share the experience from the other side as well, and to hear that it can be hard for a doctor as well to fully trust and understand, or to meet the expectations of a person who's kind of self-diagnosed. I think a lot of that frustration comes on the patient side from the fact that it can be hard to treat something if it's not being diagnosed. And so I think you often see that people within these communities of, whether it's chronic conditions or hidden illnesses, there is a lot of self-diagnosis, just because I suppose on the first hand, there's a degree to which it's validating to say, okay, I belong to a community of people who can say that there are these certain things, whether it's alternative treatments or something else that can help. Because ultimately, a person wants a diagnosis so they can begin to manage and treat the condition. So do you have any one, I guess, like thoughts about the like benefits of self-diagnosis, or maybe some of the limitations of it too, but also like how a person who's struggling to get a diagnosis should try and treat something that they feel that they have?
Mm-hmm. So will you forgive me if I say it's tricky? So just addressing one of the earlier things you said, I think that the idea of a diagnosis giving you access to a community of people with similar experiences, I think having a doctor tell you that you have something shouldn't be, the doctor isn't the gatekeeper to you having access to that community. I think if you have a collection of symptoms or a collection of experiences that make you feel like you belong to that community, you belong to that community. That's not for me to say or to not say. And I mean, I'm certainly not going to police your interaction with that community. So I would totally encourage people to engage with communities of people who share similar symptoms and experiences. And I know that you and I have looked at one Instagram page, for example, where they just look at all kinds of medical and complicated, like medically unexplained symptoms and just less common conditions which are maybe not adequately managed. And it just brings people together to discuss what works for them. And I think that's really helpful. And it also raises the point that, we may be able to give you a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean that we're able to suddenly give you a treatment that's going to be incredible. And I think it's like you were saying, there's this expectation that doctors have access to treatments that just work. And quite a lot of the time, the most effective treatments might not be something that comes from a doctor. And I think one of the really difficult and distressing things for the medical profession can be when, in the case, for example, of chronic abdominal pain, when we have patients who end up undergoing kind of regular exploratory abdominal surgery, so having operations to look into the pelvis and into the bowel to see if there's something wrong, because a patient presents with such excruciating pain or difficult symptoms, and it comes to a point where we have to surgically explore that abdomen. And sometimes we find something, and sometimes we do have to explore a bunch of times before you find that actually there is an endometriosis there or something else. But there's a huge number of cases where a patient will have operation after operation after operation, and there's nothing there. And that's just a situation when the answer to those problems isn't surgical, and it may not be medical. And I think the more you can engage with communities of people who have similar experiences, the more you can find other ways to manage these conditions. And sometimes even the best medical treatment, for example, with chronic pain, there are lots of medications you can take, and you can escalate medication up to a certain point. But at the end of the day, with some chronic pain, the most important part of that strategy is learning to cope with it, and accepting to some extent that I'm having real physical pain, and no amount of medication is going to stop that. And I can either live a life where I'm experiencing really intense side effects from all of the medication I'm taking, and my quality of life is poor, or I can learn to some extent to cope with a certain level of pain and have really bad days and some okay days. And that's where we are. And that's obviously not an ideal situation. It's not something that anyone would wish for. But again, it's about kind of managing expectations, and having people listen to you. And sometimes the doctor isn't the right person to listen to you, because it's not something that we have the resources to do. If we could sit there with every patient for half an hour or more and just kind of help them to get through this stuff, I think a lot of people would love to do that. but it's just not. It's not the situation that we live in. It's not the system that we live in. So I think sometimes it's just the wrong place to go looking for it. But yeah, I think finding a really kind of strong community of people with similar experiences can be really useful. I would say the counterpoint to that is that I think if you find you're in a situation where a group of people are trying to kind of find ways to get around the medical system to kind of subvert it to get into treatment or to get a diagnosis, or if it becomes kind of adversarial where it becomes kind of a melting pot of ideas about why medical professionals are bad, I think that's obviously not going to be as fruitful. But if it's a kind of positive sharing of experiences and and anecdotal knowledge from people about what's helpful, I think that can only be a good thing.
I think as well, one of the benefits of community is maybe that it opens people's minds to the fact there might not be a single treatment that works as well, right? I think you've talked in the past about how symptoms can be on a spectrum, and I think my experience with having met lots of people with different kind of hard to diagnose illnesses or chronic conditions is that they can be very unique to each individual, and a medication or a holistic treatment that works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for everybody else. So do you think, in the same way as having an open mind about diagnosis, it's maybe important to have an open mind about the types of treatment that might work for you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every situation, every patient is really different, and one of our jobs as doctors is to try and simplify everything and put everyone in a box with a specific treatment plan, because that makes it manageable and bearable. Bearable. So I think being open-minded to the treatments as well is really important. And I think most doctors in general would advocate for people exploring kind of safe alternative therapies alongside any recommended medical therapies. And I think what is recognized is that the major benefit that people get from alternative practitioners, regardless of what their approach is that they do have that time. They have time to empathize to a greater extent. They have time to listen, and they use physical touch in a way that's very therapeutic, which is kind of either inappropriate or kind of out of context in a medical consultation. Mm-hmm. So, if you have massage and acupuncture, the needles themselves may have little or no effect kind of from a purely scientific standpoint, but the fact that someone has physically interacted with you, shown you that they care, and provided a service to you which you felt would help you, without asking questions, they've just offered you a service. I think that has huge therapeutic benefit, and I think one of the things that we struggle with in general as a community is the idea that a placebo can be a good thing, and that it's not being disparaging if I said that I thought that acupuncture was largely a placebo. If it has a positive effect for someone who's really struggling to get help, and they find that it alleviates their symptoms, that's an incredibly positive thing and an incredibly good thing. I think the tricky thing then is, if it's that effective, why isn't it available on NHS? And then we get into a whole discussion about, how clinical trials testing is against a placebo. So the placebo effect is discounted in those situations. And it becomes difficult to justify an expensive placebo as opposed to a cheap one. But that's a whole other shebang.
Yeah, I don't know that we should get into that conversation right now, because I think it's quite a big one. But ultimately, what you're saying is that it could be important for people with a self-diagnosed or otherwise. It's important to maybe be open-minded and try different treatments, and whether they're kind of like medically prescribed or not, if they have a positive impact for you, then that's only a good thing, and it's not necessarily something to avoid. Essentially, like a medical diagnosis and a medical treatment might not be the only solutions for a person.
Yeah, I would say that I think it's worth telling your GP what other things you're trying, not necessarily to get their opinion on it or to try and get it on the NHS or say that they don't want to engage with the GP anymore because something else is working. But I think particularly with alternative, so with herbal supplements, for example, there are some which have really significant interactions with other medications. So I think it's important to kind of keep your GP informed of what other things you're trying. And I think if you find something that's really working for you, your GP will be really happy to hear that you found something that is helpful. So yeah, I like to think of them as, I guess, complementary therapies rather than alternative therapies, because hopefully you'll have a GP that understands that if something's helping you, that's a good thing for everyone.
And are there any alternative therapies that are offered through the NHS that we can talk about?
Yeah, so there are. I think the funding is very different in different areas, and so different things will be commissioned, different services will be commissioned by different groups within the NHS. So there isn't a kind of straightforward answer to that. But yeah, I think certainly in the past there were some areas that would offer acupuncture or dry needling for certain conditions. But again, because it's on the NHS, there are quite specific criteria about who would be eligible for that. So it's not something, I mean, it's something that you can discuss with your GP. I think they're becoming less common rather than more common. But certainly if you have an open discussion with your GP, they're going to be honest with you about what's available. Mm-hmm. And equally, if you're someone who has chronic pain, you're being managed by a pain team in the hospital, they'll know what's available in your area.
Okay, so again, it's kind of a case of asking and finding out rather than having certain assumptions about what might be available. I mean, that sounds good. I think as well, like ultimately what I think we've talked about today is it's tricky from both sides, right? Like that's the word you've used repeatedly. I think assuming that it's not going to be a quick and easy process, acknowledging that this is something that like takes time, probably like takes a number of conversations, involves some form of relationship building with your GP. That's obviously difficult in itself if a person has chronic pain, chronic fatigue, depression. Is there anything that can kind of help a person to manage that experience as well? Like I think you've touched on things like CBT in the past that can maybe like help to give somebody some techniques or some ways to like manage even just that experience, even if it's not going to help them with their symptoms or their overall condition.
Yeah, so there's a few things there, but yeah, in general, I think CBT is a really good approach in general, and I think if CBT was something that was just part of a curriculum that we all went through when we were younger, I think the world would probably be a better place, because essentially all it is a set of tools that help you reframe your experiences and reframe just your day-to-day life in a way that makes it make a bit more sense and makes it more manageable. And I think that one of the problems we have is that when we suggest CBT, it immediately kind of takes the conversation down the are you saying it's all in my head? Are you calling me crazy? Are you trying to make this a mental health diagnosis as opposed to a physical health diagnosis? And I think that's a kind of real branding nightmare for CBT, is that it's seen as something dismissive rather than being seen as a really kind of concrete, proactive step, which we could probably all benefit from. So I definitely think that's something worth doing. And it's something that you can just teach yourself online or from books or from audiobooks. So I think that's something that's worth having a look at. Obviously, if you access that kind of service through the health service, then there can be massive delays involved just because it's such a demanded service. And then, the quality of the CBT that you get might not be, perfect quality. I would still recommend people embrace it if they're offered it through their doctor. But equally, if you're someone who's kind of motivated and is able to kind of to invest the energy, because I know a lot of people just won't be able to kind of bring themselves to pick up a book and kind of plow through it. I know that can be a really difficult first step. But if you can, I would encourage you to give it a shot. It certainly can't do any harm, and I think it can help a lot of people. And yeah, I think the other thing, like we've said, is that there's a lot of kind of bad press around people seeing diagnoses as mental health diagnoses as opposed to physical health diagnoses. I think that's a real problem with modern medicine, is that we really distinguish between those two things, and we much more have to see them as intertwined, in the same way that we're increasingly recognizing that, you know, the gut and the brain are kind of intimately interconnected, and having gut symptoms can be a real physical manifestation of things happening in your brain or in your mind. I think we also need to accept that, you know, all of your physical symptoms are to some extent a reflection of what's happening in your mind and in your brain. You know, your brain has the power to massively amplify or massively silence symptoms like pain, but also kind of physical things like, you know, what we would call a pseudoseizure or other kind of real physical, visible manifestations and symptoms. They can be something which your mind and your brain are creating. It's not to say that they're to do with being crazy or having you know, a pure psychiatric problem. But the mind and the body are so intertwined that you have to accept that for any condition, there's going to be some psychology and some psychiatry kind of interwoven into that. And again, it's part of kind of embracing a really kind of broad approach to treating people. You need to have a really holistic view, which is maybe ironic coming from a doctor, because that's probably what patients have been telling us since the beginning of time. But yeah, I think when a treatment is offered, you have to weigh up, could this potentially help me? And in the worst case, could it do me any harm? And I think if you're offered a psychological treatment, I can't imagine that there is any potential harm. So I think even if your instinct is to kind of turn your back on that and say, that sounds dismissive, I want to avoid that, just try it. What's the worst that could happen? Someone is offering you something to try to help, even if it may not be the thing that you primarily want, and even if you think it might not be the most beneficial treatment for you. If it's going to improve your symptoms by 5%, then, you know, carpe diem.
Yeah, I suppose also, if it doesn't work for you, you can check it off and say, well, I tried that. What's next? What else can I try? Which helps you get closer to finding the treatment that works best for you as well.
Yeah, I think the caveat is that some things you need to try for a period of time before you decide that they haven't worked for you. And, you know, there are lots of medical therapies where you have to wait a couple of months before you know if there's a benefit. And there may be, so for example, with SSRI, the type of antidepressant which is commonly used, your symptoms in the first couple of weeks can be much worse. And then you won't get the full benefit for a couple of months potentially. So there can be a really difficult time where you have to just cope with the rough patch to get to the smooth. But yeah, I think you're right that it's worth trying things in general. And if they absolutely don't work or they haven't helped, then yeah, cross them off the list and just say, you know, thank you for offering me something. It didn't work. What's next? Like, let's move on.
I suppose with that as well is, again, acknowledging the idea that, like, there might not be this perfect panacea cure-all, that things will take time, and that it might be useful to have, coping mechanisms and things in place to help you with that process as well, rather than thinking, I have a chronic condition or this illness that I can cure. It's more about, I need to go on this journey of finding all the things that can help me to manage this. Is that something that's kind of represented in a way that kind of a doctor would approach it to? Are you presenting treatments as solutions, or are you presenting them as things that may or may not help?
I think, yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think medicine in general is becoming more kind of protocolized, and like I said earlier, we have a tendency to kind of recognize a pattern, stamp a label on something, and then push it into a protocol or an algorithm which says that, you know, if this and this is the case, then you refer to this service, and then they'll have an algorithm for what they do next. And so I think in that respect, then to some extent, yes, we do kind of say, congratulations, this is your label, this is the pathway that you go down, and the intention is to make you feel better. I think in general, doctors do try and avoid promising cure where the chance of having cure is low. I think doctors are getting better at establishing reasonable expectations, but it's really varies. Like, different people will have a different skill set, and you may get some doctors who are just less experienced in this area, and maybe do give false expectations or kind of give people the impression that you know, yes, I'm going to give you this label, and you're going to, you know, we're going to take it away from you in a year because you'll be better. But I think in general, I don't know what I think in general. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah. Again, I suppose it kind of lends itself to having conversations with your GP and understanding their approach to your situation, and then determining if they're the right GP for you before continuing that conversation. And then at that point, you might choose to go somewhere else and find somebody that maybe has more expertise or a more sympathetic view to what you're after, or who maybe take more of an approach to seeing treatment as a step towards managing something rather than as a cure-all.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, go on.
One of the GP practices I worked in recently, there was a really stark difference. There were a couple of GPs who were very much, you know, business minded, like, you know, crack through the patients, solve the problems as quickly as possible, and they would find it, I think, quite frustrating if there was a complex situation that came up. And then there were another half of the GPs in the practice who were, you know, very empathetic and very, you know, they would spend a long time with their patients, and they'd end up staying late a lot of the days because they were kind of going in depth. And I think when I approach a GP as a patient, I want that kind of like wham bam, in and out, you know, get your prescription and go. And I would find it really frustrating if I was being seen by a GP who was really trying to kind of connect with me on a deeper level and explore things. So yeah, I think it's certainly not saying that there are good and bad GPs, but it's like the Tinder of medicine. You have to kind of keep swiping until you find a personality that matches with you. And you may find that they are in the same practice. Equally, there are a lot of times when in a 10-minute consultation, we really struggle to kind of get to the bottom of something, and we need to go away and discuss it with all of our colleagues. And quite often we'll have a clinical meeting a couple of times a week where we discuss things that we can't quite get our heads around. And then, you know, after having a conversation with a bunch of different people with different levels of experience and different approaches to seeing these patients, then it may be that the next consultation you have with that GP is just much more rewarding for both of you, because, you know, in that interim period, they've gathered a lot of insights from other people that they can maybe bring to the table. So like I said earlier, I would never go on have a single encounter with the GP and then kind of just snap away from it. Obviously, there are situations when that would be appropriate, but I think in general, give things a chance, and just see if you can make it work.
Cool, thank you. That's yeah, I think that's the most useful piece of advice from this conversation is just, yeah, trying to build a relationship and be patient with that experience so you can get the most out of it, rather than making snap judgments based on maybe not being instantly diagnosed with something that's difficult to diagnose in the first place. I think we've been talking for a little while And I don't necessarily want this to run on too long. I think there's probably a few other things we could talk about, but for now, do you maybe want to, like, are there any resources you want to recommend or anything else you want to touch on before we kind of wrap things up?
Yes, I think you mentioned that we'd probably kind of leave a list of links somewhere afterwards anyway. I think just having a look at what was available myself, just from a cheeky search on the internet earlier, it's interesting to see, you know, if you go through the NHS, nhs.uk website, it has a pretty good summary of, I think, how most GPs would approach what we call medically unexplained symptoms, which can range from things like chronic fatigue syndrome to IBS, fibromyalgia, which I think are some of the common things that GPs see within this category. And I think it's a quite reasonable review of the kind of things we've talked about. So it talks about CBT, it talks about some medication, it talks about, you know, if you think that your GP has missed something, it's completely reasonable to ask for a second opinion. It talks about things you can do from a self-help perspective as well. And then one of the other ones that I came across was the National Organization for Rare Disorders, which I think it's a UK organization because it talks about collaboration with some trusts in London, for example. And that frames it in a very kind of neurologically focused way, as opposed to things being more psychological. And I think all of, you know, when you do go on this journey of trying to find ways to manage your condition and manage your symptoms and your experiences, I think part of it is just about finding voices that reflect how you see your world. So I think it's really interesting to see that there are resources that kind of view things in a kind of quite primary care, relatively holistic way, and there are other organizations which kind of talk about it from a very neurological point of view. And I think for some people that would be really helpful, just because it may be the way that they understand their experiences, and that may kind of empower them to help in their own way. And the third and final one that I came across was a website called patientvoices.org.uk, which looks at kind of stories from patient carers and from members of staff as well. And I think just in terms of becoming someone who's kind of more self-aware and more aware of the experiences of people around them and communities of people that have similar experiences, I think it can be really, really useful to see those stories, to read those stories, because I think sometimes, you know, your closest friends and family might have had those conversations with you, but I think if you hear those stories from people who are slightly removed from your situation, you can get some kind of more novel and just different perspectives on what you're going through, and I think that can be really therapeutic as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's one of the things we hear very often, especially in the kind of hidden illness world, is you don't look sick, and that can be something that friends or family might say to you because you maybe don't have these like visible symptoms. So I think, yeah, I've definitely seen like huge communities on Reddit of people with very, very niche chronic conditions who, yeah, essentially exist to like provide advice and support and validation and recommendations even for different communities, because I think it can be quite lonely if you have something that you're not able to diagnose. You can't say I have evidence that I have this thing, a doctor has confirmed it. It can be a bit alienating. So yeah, I think finding communities and other people who have similar experiences is quite an important part of this process. To touch on the kind of second resource you recommended as well, I wanted to ask if it's useful for somebody who's seeking diagnosis to have like learn some of the medical vernacular or some of the like medical terms for what they're dealing with, so they can speak about it in a more medical way versus maybe referring to things maybe in a more like generic or like non-medical way. is it useful for a patient to come to you and say, like, here are the specific things I'm experiencing based on the research I've done?
I think that's such a difficult question, because I think sometimes when someone comes into a consultation and they're kind of equipped with a certain level of kind of medical language or a degree of medical insight, it can again sometimes just throw the consultation off, because it's not something that we're prepared to hear. I mean, some GPs will find it really useful, but sometimes it can just kind of throw the relationship off a little bit. I think it's completely worth reading up about the symptoms you're experiencing and the diagnoses that you think might be relevant to you. But I think kind of being authentic in that consultation and just talking through your experience of symptoms, just from a kind of how you truly experience them, rather than trying to pigeonhole yourself into specific medical language, I think can be much more rewarding. Because if a doctor has seen similar, or patients with similar experiences and symptoms before, that's much more likely to trigger something in our minds that says, oh, this reminds me of the patient I had, which had this kind of unusual set of symptoms I had to refer on to this person. Whereas if you have someone who walks in and starts talking in medical language to you, it may just not, trigger that same light bulb, or it may seem that the patient, has some kind of weird agenda that maybe we then go off on a tangent trying to explore that slightly mysterious agenda, which may just be the patient wanting to be more efficient, and it's ended up kind of making things take a weird turn. So I think, educate yourself about your symptoms and about things that you think are maybe going on. But I don't think you should try and translate your experiences into medical language just for the purpose of trying to convey the message to the GP.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting that could actually throw a GP off and actually take them down a different route as well, because it's a piece of advice I've heard a few times from people. And yeah, I've always wondered if it's actually beneficial or not. I think, as we've touched on, the most useful thing to take away from this is maybe to like have tempered expectations about what to expect from a single interaction with your GP, and to approach it as a situation where you need to like explore what's happening to you together, so that a GP can be informed well enough to like help you to understand what's happening, and they can start to recommend treatments for that, so you can begin to explore how you manage a condition, rather than it being a single interaction where you get a diagnosis and a treatment and then everything's resolved.
Yeah, and the other thing I would like to say is just that brains are incredible, and we have so little understanding of how incredible they are. And if your brain decides, for whatever reason, that you're going to have symptoms which look like a specific condition, you're going to have those symptoms. And I think one thing that's really, really hard to come to terms with is that if we have done our best to investigate you and diagnose you, and we've sent you to all of those clinics, there is a chance that at the end of the day, an incredibly experienced consultant in neurology or any specialty might turn around to you and say, I'm sorry, you don't have this condition. And I think that can be incredibly devastating for someone who's spent, probably years, first of all, coming to terms with the symptoms, finding the confidence to kind of discuss it with other people, with their doctor, wait for all of those referrals, and then to be kind of essentially turned down at the last hurdle. And I don't think any of us give enough credit to how incredibly complex brains are and what they can do. And there are a lot of people who go through really traumatic experiences when they're younger, or which are ongoing, and the brain will convert those experiences into physical symptoms. It's not to say that the symptoms aren't happening. They will be things that, that as a doctor I could watch happening in front of me. It's not that a patient is doing it deliberately or has any control over it, but your brain can make all of those things happen. And I think if you just bear in mind, if you're willing to accept that after everything that happens, there's a possibility that your symptoms might be coming from your brain or from your mind, as a consequence of something that we can't define. I think as long as you have that in the back of your mind, then it's going to be less devastating if that ends up being the reason for what you're going through. And it's kind of a weird way to end things, but it's kind of like a...
No, I think it's relevant, right? And that it helps to set an expectation that like there might not be like a diagnosis at the end of this journey, which I think, a certain percentage of the people watching this will find. I think that is not an uncommon thing, right? People do struggle to get a diagnosis. What would actually happen in that situation if somebody determines you don't have these physical symptoms and it might be something that's created in your brain? Presumably there are still like treatments and things that can help with that, or that might help a person to explore those past traumas or whatever else as well, right? Just because they don't have the diagnosis they were expecting, that doesn't mean it's the end of their journey.
Yeah, completely. It's definitely not the end of the journey. And I think that's why it's so useful to kind of explore things in parallel as well. Because, you may find yourself, so as a medical student, many moons ago, I have sat in neurology clinics in a hospital where people have all of the symptoms that as a medical student I could think of that would represent multiple sclerosis, for example. And, an incredibly talented neurologist has assessed this and determined that actually they don't have MS. Their brain is creating all of these physical symptoms and many signs in this person, but it's not because of MS. If that happens, as you say, it's not the end of the journey. It just means that you have to kind of turn 90 degrees and see what happens next. And I think that's an incredibly difficult thing to go through. I think there'll be a grieving process associated with not having a diagnosis that you've been kind of heading towards for so long. And I think it's important more than ever at that stage to not turn your back on the medical profession, because it feels like you've been rejected by medicine. But essentially, it's just another one of those. You kind of crossed out something on a really, really long to-do list, and it just means that there's going to be another period of reflecting on your experiences, reflecting on your symptoms, and it's not going back to square one, because you have made progress through all of those years of kind of working on reaching that stage. It feels like a massive setback, but at that stage, just try not to feel rejected. Try to, you will grieve, you will reflect a lot, but at some point come back to medical practice and say, I'm willing to consider that maybe that was the wrong diagnosis. Where do we go next? And it's about finding a way to be strong enough to kind of take your GP with you on that journey, and not to kind of see them as having kind of, booted you out of the system and said, you're faking it, or we don't believe you, because that's not at all what is happening.
I guess a positive way to look at that really is that the sooner a person begins this journey and like finds the GP who they can have a conversation with and who, will explore this with them, the sooner they can start working towards that path and either obtaining the diagnosis they think they should have, or even having that diagnosis ruled out and looking at what other courses there might be as well. So I think maybe that's a positive way to look at that as well. Just to go and have those conversations to begin with, so you can start heading down that path rather than putting it off because of past maybe negative experiences with GPs, or having perhaps the wrong expectations about what might happen in an initial consultation. Cool. Well, thank you for talking about everything today that we've touched on. I think it's been really interesting. I think if I'd had access to some of this information or these perspectives. It would have helped me maybe 10 years ago when I was like first seeking diagnosis. I hope that these bits of advice are useful for people listening as well. Thank you for taking the time to kind of like share your perspective on this as well. I think often there are assumptions about what a GP or a doctor thinks about people with hard to diagnose conditions. And it's nice to be able to maybe share, your perspective on that and hear the other side of the story too.
Yeah, always nice catching up.
Absolutely.